So in other words, he analysed meaning that may have a sense but not have a reference.
Yes, this can happen, but well, this happens in two ways, and there could be names or nominal expressions like present King of France, for example, which has a sense but no reference because nobody corresponds to it. And also there is the complicated case of expressions which have a function in a sentence as contributing to its making it capable of being true or false, but don't denote anything, like predicates. Is good, is bad, is so on and so on, which themselves are what he called incomplete expressions, namely don't themselves have a reference, but contribute to giving the sentence a sense, and through its sense a reference.
And these distinctions that he introduced and his theory of meaning have in fact had a very widespread influence in philosophy, haven't they?
They've become very fashionable in recent years, that's to say, and there's been a change in anyhow in England, and perhaps, well, England and the United States to some extent, and a change in sort of main concern of philosophy. For a very, very long time, the theory of knowledge was dominant, ever since Descartes in his successors in the 17th century. The main concern has been the theory of knowledge, what we can know, and how we can know it, and how we are justified in holding the beliefs we do. And in recent years, this has given way to what's sometimes called the philosophy of logic, which is mainly concerned with questions about meaning. And here, Frege has come into great prominence. And for instance, my successor as Professor of Logic at Oxford, Michael Dummett, has devoted nearly, certainly 2 large books to Frege's work, and is concerned with exploring the implications of Frege's distinctions for a theory of meaning.
Well, Michael Dummett, who I suppose must be called the leading living commentator on Frege, makes enormously large claims for him, doesn't he? He says that he's introduced a whole new era in philosophy, that he has de-psychologized philosophy, that in the way you just explained, he dethroned the theory of knowledge from the center of philosophy, and this has changed 300 years of philosophical development.
Well, I think
do you go along with that?
Well, I think that there has been a difference of emphasis, but I think that Michael exaggerates in 2 ways. First of all, philosophers have always been concerned with meaning ever since Socrates went about saying what is knowledge, what is goodness, and so on, which is a way of asking what the Greek equivalents of these terms meant. So there's always been an interest in meaning in philosophy. And secondly, I don't think interest in the theory of knowledge has totally disappeared. I think that there are still people who are connected with concerned with this. And insofar as, even in Michael Dummett's own work, the theory of meaning is very much bound up with questions about truth and falsehood, this also doesn't entirely take us away from the theory of knowledge, because after all, the theory of knowledge is concerned with what reason we have to suppose that certain statements, propositions, are true or false. So I think that there has been a shift of emphasis, but not the great break that Dummett insists on.
Before we continue with the more recent applications of Frege's work, I want to turn to Russell for a moment. When I introduced this discussion, I emphasized the fact that Frege worked in isolation throughout almost the whole of his life. And this becomes very important when one starts to consider Russell, because poor Russell spent the first several years of his life reinventing work that Frege had already done without realizing that he'd done it, didn't he? So that should make it rather easy for you to explain to us something about the importance of Russell's very early work.
Well, I don't quite know why you say poor Russell, because it is quite true that Russell did a lot of work that Frege had done before him, but Russell also exposed a fatal deficiency in Frege's system. He showed that Frege's system of logic actually contained a paradox. I don't know if you wish to expound the contradiction of Epimenides the Cretan, who said that all Cretans were liars. It follows it comes into the category of self-defeating propositions.
And although on the surface it seems to be trivial, it's not trivial.
It's
because
not trivial.
It shows that the underlying argumentation has something wrong with it.
It does. It shows that one of Frege's essential assumptions led to contradiction. Yeah. And Russell in 1903 conveyed this in a letter to Frege, and Frege's first reaction was not, "Oh, I'm wrong." He was simply arrogant to reply, "The whole of mathematics has been shown to be worthless." Then he thought this was going too far, and he then managed to put together some sort of answer to Russell's objection, but then it was shown only after Frege's death, in fact, by a Polish edition, that Frege's answer also of the Begriffsschrift, of the Begriffsschrift, the Grundgesetze. You yourself said earlier he never wrote the third volume, and he simply gave up. From 1903 to 1925, his death, he never did anything, and this was the result.
He thought his life's work had been demolished.
Yes.
Yes.
So that, in fact, it's a very sad story.
Yes.
In his own.
Yeah. But it remains true, I don't want to press this point, that an enormous amount of the work that Russell had done and spent years over, Frege had already done, and Russell didn't know.
Yes, that is true.
But it's also true that although Frege did it first, and some experts today think that Frege did most of it better, it was through Russell that the ideas actually became famous in philosophy and influential in philosophy.
That is true. I don't know why it was that Frege's work was so neglected. Partly because, for an absurd reason, that interest in the new developments of logic was very much an English thing. People like Boole and De Morgan. It wasn't taken up in Germany, because in Germany the mistaken psychological view of logic still prevailed, and wasn't taken up in England simply because of English insularity and incompetence in foreign languages. Yeah. And it was left.
But Russell, who had been brought up by German governesses and German nurses, did know German.
Did know German. But even Russell only got it indirectly. What happened was that Russell and his collaborator Whitehead went to a congress in Paris in 1903 and met an Italian logician called Peano. And it was through Peano, whose work enormously impressed them, and who was working in the same direction, though with a less efficient system. How
was that the science of logic, which had remained virtually static for over 2,000 years since Aristotle, suddenly exploded into a whole new and enormous development.
Mainly through Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica, which it took them together about 10 years to write. Well, Russell wrote the Principles of Mathematics in 1903, where he does make acknowledgement to Frege, I think, in the preface and in the appendix.
Yes, he does, yes.
And then he went on with his tutor at Trinity, Cambridge, Whitehead, to write a 3-volume work called Principia Mathematica, in which he actually tried to do the work of deducing mathematics from logic, and it's full of formulae, and it is a stupendous work, although, as you rightly said, it doesn't quite achieve the standards of logical rigor that Frege had achieved before it. But this was the one that really popularized the subject. Then all sorts of people took it up, and it took, from then on, it has proceeded by leaps and bounds.
And it's now, so to speak, a major field of intellectual endeavor throughout the Western world, in every university.
But it's interesting, I think also should be mentioned, that one of the effects has been not so much to subdue mathematics to logic, which is what Frege and Russell wanted, but to subdue logic to mathematics. And that in recent years, mathematical logic has become more and more mathematical, and has had less and less to do with philosophy in general. And even a disciple of Frege, like Michael Dummett, is more interested in the semantic side of it, the theory of meaning, than he has hitherto shown himself to be in the purely mathematical side.